Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the US Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. Today, what I'd like to chat about is the relationship between government and economics. What is government's role in the economy? What are our assumptions about that role? And how the policies those assumptions inform, in turn, inform our politics. What raises this week's topic is the billions the country is currently spending on an illegal and unjust war, another billion for the president's vanity project, the ballroom, the fact that billionaires aren't paying any taxes, that we have oil companies profiteering off of the crisis in the Middle East, all while we're seeing cuts to social programs, things that actually help people live and even survive, food for kids, education, things like that. So the question is, why do we always seem to have money for wars and police and not for nice things like education and healthcare? What are the assumptions that lead many of us to, if not vote and support those kinds of economic ideas and policies, at least tolerate them as normal? We're going to look back to our founders and the theorists and philosophies that they look to explain why these assumptions seem to be so ingrained in our culture and our thinking about politics and governments. So first off, we're going to look at Locke again. That shouldn't be very surprising. Now, we've seen in previous videos, Locke proposed that the end of government is the protection of property rights, that this is why we institute governments. Now, we also discussed how James Wilson disagreed with this and said the chief end of government is the protection and improvement of society. However, Locke's thinking seems to have won out in our culture after the ratification of the US Constitution and in later generations. Now, what this focus on property rights does is it inherently biases government towards people who have property. Government is about defending property, so it's about defending the interests of those who have property. And we can even see this in voting rights in the early United States. Many states had property requirements for people to vote. Also implicit in Locke's idea about how property is formed and accumulated, we also get a value judgment or the beginnings of a moral framework. In Locke's theory, in the state of nature, the entire world is given to all of humanity equally. Now, we take from that common by mixing our labor with different things and thus creating property. So if we cultivate the land, if we improve it, if we mix our labor with it, it becomes our land. Now, given this language, labor becomes how we fulfill our God-given duty to dominate the earth. So with that framework, we can start to see how labor becomes a moral good, as does the accumulation of property. We're fulfilling our God-given duty, a natural duty as human beings. Now, reinforcing this rather implicit idea, we also get the Protestant work ethic. Now, this idea comes out of, or at least is informed by, the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. This doctrine said that God predestines some to salvation and others to damnation. And people went, how do we know which one we are? Because that's kind of terrifying, right? You can't do anything about it. And pastors said, well, people who are chosen, who are predestined, naturally follow the will of God. Now, what does following the will of God look like? Well, it means working really hard, being frugal, and being modest. Now, what that tends to produce in a somewhat equitable society where resources are plentiful is the accumulation of wealth. So the shorthand became, if you are wealthy, it's a sign that you're one of the chosen elect, and it's a sign of God's favor upon you. Conversely, if you're poor, you're not part of the elect and potentially damned. Poverty is a sign of a moral failure. Now, coupling with this in terms of economics, we get Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which isn't published until 1776, a number that should ring a bell. Now, Smith's argument is often read or interpreted as reinforcing many of these ideas and adding to them an argument that markets are natural. So the way the argument goes is Smith locates the market in the human constitution, and he describes the market, and particularly the market force, supply and demand, as this invisible hand that naturally regulates the market, diverting capital and resources to where they're most efficiently used. So how this works is if you make a good product, you make it efficiently, you can sell it more cheaply, you'll make more profit. And therefore, you gain and accumulate more capital, which you can reinvest. This natural market force is akin to gravity. It naturally regulates and organizes the economy. Now, what this also means is that those who accumulate wealth are inherently the best stewards of this wealth and that they've merited it through doing a good job. So we add this on to the moral framework that already existed with Locke's idea of property and the Protestant work ethic. Now, earlier I said that Smith is often interpreted or read in this sense. And to give Smith credit, he does not use the example of the invisible hand very often. And I know at least one scholar who says that Smith's actually taking the piss with this argument. Furthermore, Smith recognizes that the specialization of labor is one of the most dehumanizing forces that humanity's ever come up with. Moreover, that we would still need governments to invest in things like education and infrastructure to make this whole system work. Now, as I've told you before, many of the founders look to Locke as the inspiration for much of their political thought. A few, like Wilson, argued against it. Many also looked to Smith, including Wilson and others, and these ideas were floating around. But the term capitalism, and particularly this idea of free market capitalism, didn't come about until the mid-19th, early 20th century. During that time, these ideas and theories became assumptions that seeped into culture and the way that we thought about and talked about politics and the economy and government. And once they became assumptions, over time they became myths. They became dogmas. They're just ideas that we believe to be inherently true. Now, what this system does, or at least the system that developed out of these premises does, is it creates extreme wealth inequality. It centralizes wealth in a few elites at the top and does so through the exploitation and dehumanization of workers at the bottom. Now, this happens because this system is driven by a profit motive. The idea is to make as much money as possible. That's how you win the game. And so, yes, that can be done through innovation, development, research, but it can be done many other ways, and normally ways that are easier, cheaper, and more certain. For instance, you can cut your employees' wages, cut your overhead. You can make a crappier product. We see the financialization of markets. And so we get the stock market and investment banks where you can put your money in this market and profit without actually creating anything. You also have the formation of monopolies, which then allows them to charge whatever they want for their product because they're the only one making it. And this, again, happens naturally. It's why one of the first economic regulations that we see is antitrust laws or anti-monopoly laws. Furthermore, what this ideology also does is it provides a moral fig leaf for the wealthy elites. It presents their exploitation of the working and middle class and greed as leading to a moral good and the common good through the work of the invisible hand that will naturally guide everything to where it should go. And if it doesn't, it just means that we need less regulation. And moreover, it says that they merited their position, that this natural force or God chose them because they're so good at what they do. And so we should follow them and we should trust them. So in the mid-19th and early 20th century, when this ideological system gets put into practice, we see the wealthy elite calling themselves captains of industry, while people at the bottom called them robber barons. And we saw these rampant levels of wealth inequality and exploitation. Many looked to the government to defend and enforce their property rights. However, some of these captains of industry had enough wealth to hire their own private armies. Andrew Carnegie forms the Pinkertons, and the role of the Pinkertons is to spy on, threaten, and even violently oppress unions in order to erode them, break them up, so that Andrew Carnegie could pay his workers less and thus make more of a profit. We also see this in the institution of mill towns and mine towns. In these towns, the company would pay their workers in tokens, which they could only use at the company store. And the company store, because it was a monopoly, could charge whatever they wanted. That particular practice wasn't ended until the late 1930s. During this time, what unions are pushing for are things like the end of child labor. We're not going to send 7-year-olds into the mines because we can pay them less. Now, this system continued to go unchecked, and living conditions got worse, and we saw the introduction of financialization in the market. Now, capitalists could get a return on their investment simply through buying and selling stock and different leveraged instruments, and we get the rise of investment banks. But there aren't regulations that keep the whole system from becoming too intertwined, too leveraged, and too unstable. Eventually, in 1929, we have the stock market crash. And because we have this rampant inequality on top of it, we see the Great Depression arrive as well. And we just have rampant poverty. It's called the Great Depression for a reason. And it's important to remember the Great Depression was not just an American event. This impacted other economies around the world. In the United States, eventually the response was FDR and the New Deal. We started to regulate businesses. We started to regulate the financial sector. We created a social safety net for normal people. We created laws that protected workers' rights and made sure they got a fair wage. In part, FDR gets all of this legislation and the New Deal passed because he tells the wealthy elites who have a lot of control over politics due to their wealth, money's power coupons after all, by threatening them. He says, here's the deal, guys. You can either willingly give up some of your fortune now in the form of taxes, or you can risk losing it all when the people come for you with pitchforks and torches. Because they were getting ready to. There was a rising communist movement on the left and a rising fascist movement on the right in the United States, fed up with the inequality of working themselves to death so that somebody who already had too much could make millions more. And FDR's response works. We get the New Deal, we get Social Security, we get public works that create jobs and boost the economy. This is how the greatest generation in FDR fought fascism at home, through social programs, through making government work for normal people and protect normal people instead of biasing property and those who had it. And then this global economic shock, the Great Depression, hits Germany as well. Now, you'd think with this rampant wealth inequality, people would be frustrated with these elites, these oligarchs. And they were. But what fascism does is something really interesting. One of the many characteristics of fascism is it's a blending of corporate and state power. The Nazis were funded and brought to power by corporate elites. And what they did was they took this anger and fear about this horrible economic situation many of the German workers were in and redirected that anger not towards the oligarchs, but towards an already othered outgroup or multiple outgroups. They said this economic situation is not the CEO's fault, it's these other people. And those other people included communists, socialists, trade unionists, and then Jewish people, if we take the famous poem's ordering as historically accurate. So far from being a socialist movement, as the name proposes that it is, Nazi fascism actually attacked social policy. They broke the trade unions in Germany, and workers saw their wages decrease significantly. And this was made possible because people were angry and scared. They were easily manipulated. And they created this hierarchy of belonging where they proposed that these political and corporate elites merited their position. They were good and they represented the best in the country. While these other people, these poor people, these lazy people, these other people were not. They were holding back the country. And so to illustrate that you were part of the in-group, part of the good guys, you worked hard and you attacked the people below you instead of above you. This kept the corporate elites in power and made it so that they could make more money by treating their workers worse. And we can see the importance of the idea of work and labor in the famous sign that hung above the Auschwitz concentration camp. Work will make you free. So in this, we can see how these foundational assumptions and ideas become what we know today as Lockean liberalism or classical liberalism, and how they often lead to fascism unless regulations are put into place, which is antithetical to the very idea. If you regulate the economy, you're messing about with the natural market forces that self-regulate and organize the economy. This is why often as things get worse, people double down. If we just get rid of one more regulation, if we just free up a little bit more capital, if we give them more freedom, that market mechanism will kick in, organize everything, and prosperity will reign over all the earth. As I've said, it's an ideology, but it also has some religious undertones, not even in the Protestant work ethic idea, but this sacrificing our lives and our children to a natural force in order to appease it and bring us economic prosperity. Not my area of expertise, but I think it's something worth thinking about. Now, as I've said, after the war, globally, we start to institute these regulations on financial markets, on labor markets. We have governments now prioritizing full employment rather than property rights or price stability. Companies can no longer do what they want. We want everybody to have a job because people who have work and stability and enough are very difficult to radicalize. They saw that these economic regulations and social programs were how we fought and prevented fascism at home, because everybody recognized that the economic situation had led to the rise of fascism in Germany and World War II. After the brutality of World War II, and with it the invention of nuclear weapons, we realized as a species we could not do this again. Fascism cannot be tried again. And moreover, what these regulations and programs did was they reduced economic inequality tremendously. It's called the Great Compression. And we have this formation of a real middle class. We also in the United States see the greatest economic boom in human history. So apparently, regulating the markets worked pretty well for the markets and the economy. It produced the prosperity that deregulation had promised in Lockean liberalism. However, not everybody was thrilled with this equality and prosperity. The neoconservatives that we discussed in a recent chat as well argued for limited government, i.e. a government that is only really concerned with property rights. We should support free markets. And they also leaned into this moral framework of poverty being a moral failing. So what they said was these social programs undermined American values. It trained people to be lazy and made them immoral and even led them to become criminal. These people were freeloaders and they should suffer the consequences of their bad decisions in order to develop real American values of productivity and efficiency and hard work. If they just worked hard enough, they'd be successful. Hard work would teach them how to be real Americans. Hard work would set them free. Now, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan takes this ideology and turns it into policy. And we get what's called the neoliberal revolution. We see a similar one in the UK under Margaret Thatcher. And what they do is they say, we need to free up capital in these captains of industry to make the economy boom again. If we cut their taxes, if we cut their regulations, and they have more capital to invest and develop, we'll see an economic boom. That would mean we don't need these social programs anymore. They would create jobs, unemployment would go down, wages would go up because we'd all be making so much money. As Reagan said, a rising tide lifts all ships, and argue that the profits at the top would trickle down to the rest of us. In retrospect, I don't think many of us think it was profits that were trickling down from the elites above us. With this new iteration of liberalism in economic policy, we saw similar things. We saw wealth inequality go up. We saw wages stagnate. We saw unions get broken up. And we saw poverty increase both in numbers and severity. It did not create the economic boom that we were promised. However, as I mentioned earlier, many people have continued to double down on it and say, we just haven't cut enough regulations yet. We just cut a little bit more. If we lower their taxes just a little bit more, we'll get something. And despite the failure of this economic ideology to follow through on its promises, the last US president who explicitly and seriously questioned the ideology as such was George Bush Sr. He called Reagan's policies voodoo economics because there was no evidence that this would ever happen. Actually, the late 19th and early 20th century illustrated that it did not do what it promised and led to the rise of fascism. However, we ignored it, and we get the 2008 global financial crisis, or what we've come to call the Great Recession. And we didn't change the system. We continued to double down on it and cut regulations and vote for people who promised to cut regulations and cut taxes on the wealthy elite to give them more money to innovate more. And hopefully by now, you're seeing the pattern forming. And in the process, we've only seen normal Americans' economic precarity increase. People are less secure. The middle class is withering away. Things are getting bad. People are scared and they're angry. And at the same time, we see this rise of Neo-Fascism, that the roots of your problems, these economic issues, are illegal immigrants or leftists or Antifa. It's brown people. It's people who don't want to work, who are freeloading off of you with these social programs. If people were just not so lazy and so entitled, everything would work out just fine. And with it, we're seeing the blending of state and corporate power, particularly through just the rampant corruption in this administration. For a couple million in campaign donations, Elon Musk got to play shadow president for like a few months. And what did he do? He stole most of our personal information and deregulated a whole lot of things and crippled institutions in the government that would actually regulate his industries. We also see billionaires don't pay taxes because they've paid enough bribes. And remember, we shouldn't tax them because they're our job creators. They're not. What makes the economy work is people buying and selling things. And so the more of us normal people who have money, the bigger the economy gets. The more jobs we have because more people have more money to spend in the economy, and it grows. And we also see that poverty isn't a moral failing or because of bad decisions. We've actually seen in research that what causes bad decisions is poverty. It's not the other way around. And so at the heart of this ideology, these assumptions just don't line up with reality. That many of these premises, when we actually do the research on them, seem almost Orwellian. It's poverty that causes bad decisions, not bad decisions that cause poverty. The freedom of a lack of regulation certainly doesn't make the economy boom, creates profits for the elites and exploitation and essentially slavery for the rest of us. Yes, we might be free to buy 30 different colors and brands of cereal or a sedan, but we don't have the freedom to be healthy, to get healthcare, to make those good decisions that would lead to a better, fuller life, to spend more time with our families and to care on one another and just enjoy life. It gives us the freedom to choose between products but not the freedom to really live. But I can understand why so many of us at least tacitly consent to these positions. This ideology makes sense to us, whether it's Lockean liberalism or neoliberalism, because it's been ingrained in us. It's pervasive through our political subconscious. It makes sense when government is meant to defend property rights, whether that's funding the police or funding a war that protects American interests, i.e., corporate interests abroad. That's what government's supposed to do, according to Locke. And most of us don't consciously think that, but it fits within that framework. And that's why we always have money for war and police, but not for social programs, because those aren't seen as legitimate. They might be a luxury or a nice thing we can add on top if we have enough money, but that's not the job of government. And moreover, the way these ideologies have developed is they've presented these social programs as actually causing problems. They cause dependence. They cause the erosion of the values and morals of the country. They need to be purified. So we can see why people tend to believe these ideas, how we're trained and predisposed to believe them, especially here in the United States, where Locke's thinking is so powerful in how we understand our politics. But we can also see how Lockean liberalism and neoliberalism very easily lead to fascism and neo-fascism. But we can also learn from the response of our ancestors. People like James Wilson, who said, no, government is meant to protect and improve society. And we can also look at the greatest generation who tried to realize that idea of government by re-electing FDR 4 times in support of his New Deal. The greatest generation that fought fascism abroad and at home were for these social programs. They said, the system that we inherited broke. It's up to us to fix and improve it. And they did. They decreased wealth inequality and created the greatest economic boom in human history. Now, I'm not saying we need to reinstate the New Deal and everything that FDR did, but I do think we need to follow that lead. Take what worked and improve upon it and fix the things that are broken. And I think one of the most important ideas that, if you take nothing else away from this chat, is that it's okay to vote for social programs. These are good things. This is how the greatest generation fought fascism at home, because our economics inform our politics. And for me, I think this is one of the fundamental places we need to rethink our conception of America and Americanness, particularly in terms of how we govern ourselves. Is our government's job to protect and improve society, to protect us not only from external threats, but from corporate greed and exploitation, to help empower us to realize a greater common good together? Or at least that's part of my vision for what America and Americanness could mean. So what kind of an America and an Americanness do you want to see? And how will you respond to the current moment? What kinds of candidates will you vote for and support? What kind of policies will you advocate for and support? And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. I hope you all enjoyed this, found it interesting, educational, hopefully not too terrifying, but these are the times we live in. If you enjoyed that, I have a lot more videos on the YouTube and Substack channel. By all means, please do comment, ask questions, subscribe. All of those things I find really encouraging, and they help get this message out to an ever broader audience. So if you think other people might benefit from hearing it as well, please like and subscribe. And also, by subscribing, you'll be updated every time I put out new content, which is every Friday morning, and includes an essay that's on the same subject, but normally has a little bit tighter argumentation and a bit more detail. So for now, I'll say good evening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.